Look around you. The world feels chaotic, doesn't it? Political systems seem to be crumbling. Old institutions are losing their grip. Technology is changing faster than we can adapt. Everything feels uncertain, unstable, like we're standing on the edge of something, but we can't quite see what's on the other side. That feeling, that sense that the old world is dying and something new is being born, it's not new. It's happened before, 7 times before actually, and each time it followed the same pattern. If you're listening to this to fall asleep, perfect. That's exactly why I make these. So maybe subscribe and tell me where you are and what time it is right now. I love checking comments and seeing Tokyo at dawn, Toronto at midnight, all experiencing this moment together across the planet. Because what we're talking about tonight, it's bigger than any one place or time. It's about all of us. Here's the thing that historians don't usually tell you. History isn't a straight line marching from primitive past to enlightened future. That's what we learned in school, right? Ancient empires, then the Middle Ages, then the Renaissance, then the Industrial Revolution, and now here we are at the pinnacle of human achievement. Except that's not how it actually works. Civilizations don't build on each other like steps on a ladder. They rise, they flourish, they dominate their world, and then they collapse. Completely. And something entirely new emerges from the ashes. The ancient Greeks knew this. They talked about the great year, cycles of creation and destruction that repeated endlessly. The Hindus described yugas, vast epochs where civilizations would rise to impossible heights and then vanish. Even the Bible hints at it. Cycles of kingdoms rising and falling, ages coming and going. But these weren't just myths or religious symbolism. They were observations, pattern recognition by people who had studied history deeply enough to see what was really happening. In the 20th century, serious historians started noticing the same thing. Oswald Spengler, a German philosopher, wrote an entire book called The Decline of the West, where he argued that civilizations are like organisms. They're born, they grow, they mature, they age, and they die. Not because of outside forces, not because they get conquered or run out of resources, but because they have an internal life cycle, a pattern. Arnold Toynbee, a British historian, spent decades cataloguing every civilization he could find and discovered they all went through the same stages: rise, peak, breakdown, collapse. Every single one. No exceptions. And then there are the controversial theorists, the ones mainstream academia doesn't like to talk about. The ones who claim the pattern isn't just similar, it's identical. That civilizations rise and fall on precise timescales, following mathematical cycles you can predict like clockwork. Some say it's generational, patterns that repeat every 80 to 100 years. Others claim it's astronomical, tied to long cycles in Earth's orbit and the sun's activity. A few whisper about hidden hands, groups that understand the pattern and use it to maintain power across civilizational transitions. Crazy? Maybe. But here's what's not crazy. The pattern is real. 7 times in recorded history, a complete civilization has risen, dominated its world, and then collapsed so thoroughly that the next civilization had to essentially start over. And right now, as you listen to this, the 7th is dying. The 8th is already being born. You can see it if you know where to look. You can feel it in the instability around us. The question isn't whether it's happening. The question is what comes next and what role you'll play in it. By the time we're done tonight, you're going to see history differently. You're going to see your own life differently. Because once you understand the pattern, everything changes. Before we can understand the pattern, we need to answer a question that's deceptively simple. What exactly is a civilization? Most people will tell you it's about cities, writing systems, organized government, maybe some monumental architecture. The textbook definition goes something like this. A civilization is a complex society with urban development, social stratification, symbolic communication systems, and perceived separation from the natural environment. That's accurate as far as it goes, but it misses something fundamental, something that makes civilizations different from every other kind of human organization. A civilization isn't just a collection of cities and technologies. It's not just an empire that happens to last a long time. It's something deeper, something that operates at a level most people never consciously recognize. A civilization is a complete worldview, a shared story so powerful that it binds millions of people together across centuries, making them think in similar ways, value similar things, organize their lives according to similar principles, even when they're separated by vast distances and have never met. Think about it this way. You can destroy a city and rebuild it. You can topple an empire and replace it with another. But a civilization is the invisible framework that makes people build cities in certain ways and organize empires according to certain principles in the first place. It's the water the fish swims in, so ubiquitous that most people living within it never even notice it exists. They just assume the world naturally works the way their civilization says it does. This is where things get interesting, because once you start looking at history through this lens, you realize that empires and civilizations are not the same thing at all. The Roman Empire was vast, powerful, technologically impressive, but it wasn't a civilization unto itself. It was an expression of classical civilization, the Greco-Roman worldview that dominated the Mediterranean for over 1,000 years. When Rome fell, classical civilization didn't end immediately. It continued in Byzantium for another 1,000 years, adapting, evolving, but maintaining that fundamental classical worldview about politics, philosophy, the relationship between the individual and the state. Civilizations are the mother systems from which empires are born. Multiple empires can rise and fall within a single civilization, each expressing the underlying worldview in different ways, adapting it to new circumstances, but they're all drawing from the same deep well of assumptions about how reality works, what matters, what's worth fighting for, what constitutes a good life. This matters because if you confuse empires with civilizations, you'll misunderstand history completely. You'll think the fall of Rome ended something fundamental, when really it was just one empire within a larger civilizational framework transitioning into its next phase. So who figured this out? Who first mapped these invisible patterns? The answer takes us to some of the most controversial and fascinating thinkers of the last century. The first was Oswald Spengler, a German schoolteacher who published a book in 1918 called The Decline of the West. Spengler's timing was perfect, or perfectly terrible depending on your perspective. Europe had just torn itself apart in World War I. Millions were dead. The old certainties about progress and civilization seemed like cruel jokes. And here comes Spengler with a radical thesis. Civilizations are like organisms. They're born, they grow, they mature, they age, and eventually they die. Nothing can stop this process. It's baked into the structure of civilizations themselves. Spengler argued that Western civilization, which he dated from around 900 AD, was now entering its final phase, what he called the civilization stage as opposed to the culture stage. In this final phase, creativity dies, tradition becomes empty formalism, people abandon the countryside for massive cities, money becomes more important than blood or honor, and strong authoritarian leaders emerge to manage the chaos. He was writing in 1918, remember. 15 years before a certain Austrian corporal would take power in Germany. Spengler's predictions seemed uncomfortably prescient to many of his readers. But Spengler didn't just theorize about the West. He identified 8 distinct civilizations throughout history: Egyptian, Babylonian, Indian, Chinese, Classical, Arabian, Mexican, and Western. Each one, he argued, followed the same pattern of birth, growth, maturity, and death. Each one developed its own unique way of understanding space, time, mathematics, art, politics, and each one eventually exhausted its creative potential and hardened into the frozen forms of late civilization before finally collapsing. The academic world mostly rejected Spengler's ideas as too deterministic, too mystical, too uncomfortable. But they couldn't ignore him either, because his framework explained things that conventional history struggled with. Why do civilizations seem to go through similar phases? Why does creativity cluster in certain periods and then fade? Why do late-stage civilizations develop such similar characteristics, regardless of their technology or geography? Then came Arnold Toynbee, a British historian who spent decades writing his 12-volume masterwork, A Study of History. Toynbee agreed with Spengler that civilizations follow patterns, but he rejected the determinism. Civilizations aren't organisms doomed to die, he argued. They're responses to challenges. When a society faces environmental, military, or social challenges, it either develops creative responses and grows stronger, or it fails to respond and stagnates. Civilizations die not because death is inevitable, but because they stop being able to adapt. Toynbee identified more civilizations than Spengler, eventually settling on about 26. Some were independent, others were satellites or arrested civilizations that never fully developed. But his key insight was this: civilizations are shaped by their founding challenges and their responses to them. Egyptian civilization developed its unique characteristics as a response to the challenge of the Nile's floods. Classical civilization developed as a response to the chaos following the Bronze Age collapse. Western civilization emerged from the challenge of barbarian invasions and the collapse of Roman authority. This was more optimistic than Spengler. It meant civilizations could potentially renew themselves if they could generate creative responses to new challenges. But Toynbee's later volumes grew darker. He observed that civilizations typically fail not from external conquest, but from internal breakdown. The creative minority that had led the civilization's growth becomes a dominant minority that rules through force rather than inspiration. The majority withdraws its allegiance, creating what Toynbee called a schism in the soul of civilization. Eventually, a universal state emerges, a final empire that seems stable, but is actually the death rattle of the civilization. Rome was the universal state of classical civilization. Is America the universal state of Western civilization? Toynbee never quite said it directly, but the implication hung there, uncomfortable and provocative. Later came Samuel Huntington with his Clash of Civilizations thesis in the 1990s. Huntington argued that in the post-Cold War world, conflicts would increasingly be between civilizations rather than between nations or ideologies. He identified 7 or 8 major civilizations still active: Western, Latin American, Orthodox, Islamic, Hindu, Cynic, Japanese, and possibly African. His thesis was controversial, seen by many as justifying cultural conflict, but it reinforced the idea that civilizations are the fundamental organizing units of human society, more important than nations, more durable than political systems. There were others too, less known but no less fascinating. Carroll Quigley taught at Georgetown and argued that civilizations go through 7 stages from mixture to invasion. He believed Western civilization had entered its final stage in the early 20th century. Philip Bagby wrote a mathematical analysis of civilizational patterns. David Wilkinson mapped the network of civilizations, arguing they merge over time into a single global system. Pitirim Sorokin proposed that civilizations oscillate between ideational, idealistic, and sensate cultural phases. Each thinker added pieces to the puzzle, mapping the invisible architecture of human history. But here's where all these theories converge on something deeply unsettling. If civilizations really are like organisms, if they really do follow predictable patterns, then we should be able to diagnose where our civilization is in its life cycle. We should be able to identify the symptoms of civilizational aging, the warning signs of approaching death. And if those symptoms are present, if we're living through the final phase of Western civilization, then we should also be able to identify where and how the next civilization is emerging, because that's the other pattern all these thinkers noticed. Civilizations don't just die, they give birth. The breakdown of one civilizational order creates the conditions for the emergence of the next. This isn't just academic theorizing. This is about understanding the moment we're actually living through. Are we witnessing the normal churn of empires rising and falling within a stable civilization? Or are we living through something much more fundamental? Are we in the twilight of one entire way of organizing human consciousness and the dawn of something radically new? The 7 civilizations that came before us all left clues. They all showed similar patterns in their rise and fall. They all went through recognizable stages. They all developed similar symptoms as they approached their endpoints. If we can map those patterns, if we can understand what happened to them, maybe we can understand what's happening to us. Maybe we can see the shape of what's coming next. So let's go back. Let's walk through the lost worlds that came before. Let's see what they can teach us about the pattern hidden in plain sight. Let's start where most historians start, Sumer, southern Mesopotamia. Around 4,500 BCE, though some researchers are starting to whisper that the dates might be wrong, that the archaeological layers might be hiding something older. The Sumerians gave us writing, the wheel, complex mathematics, astronomy so advanced they could predict eclipses. They built ziggurats that still stand today, massive stepped pyramids that served as temples, administrative centers, and astronomical observatories all at once. But here's what keeps historians up at night. The Sumerians didn't gradually develop writing. It appears suddenly, fully formed, in the archaeological record. One layer, nothing. Next layer, complete cuneiform writing system capable of expressing complex legal concepts, religious ideas, astronomical observations. It's like someone flipped a switch. Even more mysterious, the Sumerians themselves claimed they didn't invent their civilization. Their own texts say the knowledge was given to them by the Apkallu, 7 sages who emerged from the sea before the Great Flood. Now, mainstream archaeology dismisses this as mythology, but it's worth asking, why would a civilization credit others for its own achievements? The Sumerians thought they would last forever. They didn't. By 2000 BCE, they were gone, absorbed into the Babylonian and Assyrian empires that followed. Their cities became ruins, their language forgotten for thousands of years until archaeologists finally deciphered it in the 19th century. While Sumer was flourishing in Mesopotamia, something equally remarkable was happening along the Nile. Ancient Egypt, the civilization that built the pyramids, developed medicine that wouldn't be matched for millennia, created art so technically perfect it looks like it could have been made yesterday. The mainstream timeline puts the first Egyptian dynasty around 3100 BCE, but geologists looking at water erosion patterns on the Sphinx keep suggesting something uncomfortable. The erosion patterns indicate rainfall, heavy rainfall, the kind that hasn't occurred in that region for at least 7,000 years, maybe longer, which would make the Sphinx, and possibly other monuments, far older than any pharaoh we know about. And then there's the precision. The Great Pyramid's base is level to within 2 centimeters across a base of 230 meters. Its sides are aligned to true north with an accuracy of 3/60ths of a single degree. We can barely match that precision with modern laser equipment, yet somehow workers with copper tools managed it 4,500 years ago, or earlier, depending on who you ask. The Egyptians believed their civilization was eternal, ordained by the gods, unchangeable. They were wrong. By the time Rome conquered Egypt in 30 BCE, Cleopatra lived closer in time to the iPhone than to the building of the Great Pyramid. The ancient kingdom had already been ancient history for thousands of years. Now shift your attention east, the Indus Valley Civilization, Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro, cities that flourished from around 3300 to 1300 BCE across what's now Pakistan and northwest India. These weren't primitive settlements. They had sophisticated urban planning, standardized brick sizes, advanced sewage systems that wouldn't be matched in Europe until the Roman Empire. Some cities had running water, indoor plumbing, public baths. Their seals show a writing system we still cannot decipher. Hundreds of symbols, thousands of inscriptions, and after a century of trying, we still don't know what they were saying. The mystery deepens when you realize the Indus Valley people disappeared suddenly. Around 1900 BCE, the great cities were abandoned, not destroyed by war, not burned, just abandoned. Theories range from climate change to river shifts to disease, but nobody knows for certain. An entire civilization, technologically advanced, covering an area larger than ancient Egypt, just vanished. Their knowledge, whatever it was, went with them. Further east still, something else was stirring. The Chinese civilization, emerging along the Yellow River around 2100 BCE, though recent archaeological finds keep pushing that date back. The Shang dynasty, once thought to be purely legendary, turned out to be real when archaeologists found their cities and their oracle bones. And before the Shang, there are whispers of even earlier dynasties, the Xia, whose existence remains controversial because we haven't definitively found their cities yet. But every few years, another site gets excavated that might, just might, be evidence they existed. What makes China unique is continuity. Unlike the others, Chinese civilization never completely collapsed. It transformed, dynasties rose and fell, invaders came and were absorbed, but the cultural thread remained unbroken for over 4,000 years. At least that's the story. Whether that continuity is real or constructed by later historians trying to create a coherent narrative, that's another question entirely. Across the Pacific, something extraordinary was happening in complete isolation. The Mesoamerican civilizations, the Olmec, Maya, Aztec. The mainstream timeline puts the Olmec around 1500 BCE, but they built massive stone heads weighing up to 50 tons, carved from basalt quarried 80 kilometers away. How they transported them, nobody is entirely sure. The Maya developed mathematics independently, including the concept of zero, which wouldn't appear in Europe for another 1,000 years. They created calendars so accurate they could predict astronomical events millennia in the future. They built pyramids that align with stellar constellations with precision that suggests knowledge we didn't think they possessed. And then there's the Mediterranean, classical civilization, Greece and Rome, the foundation of Western thought, democracy, philosophy, engineering. Rome built aqueducts and concrete that still stand today. We only recently figured out why Roman concrete is actually more durable than modern concrete. They knew something we forgot and are only now rediscovering. The Romans thought their empire would last forever. They called it eternal. It lasted about 500 years in the west, longer in the east, but it fell nonetheless. Which brings us to number 7, Western civilization. The one we're living in right now, born from the ashes of Rome, shaped by Christianity, refined through the Renaissance and Enlightenment, turbocharged by the Industrial Revolution. It's given us modern science, democracy, human rights, technology that would seem like magic to any previous age, and like all the others, it believes it will last forever. But here's what the pattern reveals. Every single one of these civilizations thought it was unique, special, exempt from the forces that destroyed those that came before. Every single one believed its gods, its knowledge, its power made it permanent. Every single one was wrong, and every single one left behind mysteries that suggest they knew things we've forgotten. technologies that appeared and disappeared, knowledge that seems too advanced for the time, sudden collapses that don't make sense, missing pieces that archaeologists spend careers trying to explain. Some researchers go further. They suggest these 7 civilizations we can document might not be the only ones, that before recorded history, in those mysterious millennia after the Ice Age ended and before writing appeared, there might have been others. Experiments in human organisation that rose and fell, leaving so few traces that we can't be certain they existed at all. Graham Hancock and others point to myths and legends found in cultures worldwide, stories of advanced civilizations destroyed by catastrophe. Mainstream academia dismisses these ideas as pseudoscience, but the questions remain uncomfortable. If a civilization fell 15,000 years ago, what traces would survive? How would we recognize them? What we know for certain is this: 7 documented civilizations, each following a remarkably similar pattern: birth, growth, flourishing, decline, transformation, or death. The cycle repeats with such regularity it stops feeling like accident and starts feeling like law, which raises the question that brings us here. If 7 have risen and fallen following the same pattern, and if we're living in what might be the twilight of the 7th, what does the pattern tell us comes next? In 1918, a German schoolteacher named Oswald Spengler published a book that would haunt Western intellectuals for the next century: The Decline of the West. 2 volumes, over 1,000 pages, dense with philosophy and historical analysis. Most people never read it. Those who did either dismissed it as pessimistic nonsense or found themselves unable to stop thinking about it. Because Spengler made a prediction, a detailed, specific, unsettling prediction about where Western civilization was headed. And with each passing decade, more of what he described has come true. Spengler wasn't interested in politics or economics in the way most historians were. He was looking for something deeper: patterns, rhythms, the hidden morphology of civilizations. He believed that civilizations were like living organisms. They weren't just collections of people and institutions. They were entities with their own life cycles, their own inevitable progression from birth to death. And just like organisms, they couldn't escape their destiny. You could see where they were in their life cycle if you knew what to look for, and once you knew, you could predict where they were going. Every civilization, Spengler argued, passes through 4 seasons: spring, summer, autumn, winter. Each season has its own character, its own spirit, its own way of seeing the world. In spring, a civilization is born. Everything is fresh, creative, deeply spiritual. Art is symbolic and mystical. Religion is alive with genuine faith. People see the world as full of meaning and mystery. Think of medieval Europe. Gothic cathedrals reaching toward heaven. Crusaders dying for beliefs they held with absolute conviction. Monks copying manuscripts in candlelit cells. That was spring. Then comes summer. The civilization is maturing, expanding its power. Philosophy emerges, questioning the old certainties. Art becomes more realistic, more concerned with human experience than divine mystery. Social structures formalize. The civilization is building the foundations of what will become its golden age. This was Renaissance Europe. Leonardo, Michelangelo, the rediscovery of classical learning. Still creative, still vital, but more worldly than what came before. Autumn is the peak. The civilization reaches its highest cultural expression. This is when it produces its greatest philosophers, its most enduring art, its most sophisticated political systems. But it's also when the first cracks appear. The deep spiritual unity of spring is gone. People are more individualistic, more critical, more aware of contradictions. For the West, this was the Enlightenment through the 19th century. Beethoven and Goethe, Newton and Darwin, democracy and industrial revolution. Brilliant, accomplished, but already beginning to hollow out from within. Then winter arrives, and winter, Spengler said, is where civilizations go to die. Not quickly, not dramatically, but inexorably over centuries. In winter, spirituality gives way to materialism. Nobody really believes anymore, not in the depths of their soul. Religion becomes social custom or fundamentalist reaction, not lived truth. Art loses meaning, becoming either pure entertainment or incomprehensible experimentation. Philosophy exhausts itself, descending into nihilism or pointless academic games. Democracy degenerates into plutocracy, rule by wealth rather than wisdom. The masses become urbanized, disconnected from the land and from tradition. Great cities swell with rootless populations. Money becomes the only value anyone can agree on. Politics becomes theatre. Caesarism, Spengler called it. Not necessarily dictatorship, though that's possible, but the rise of powerful individuals or oligarchies who operate behind democratic facades. Real power concentrating in fewer hands while the forms of democracy persist. Elections continue, but they decide less and less. The important decisions get made elsewhere, by people whose names you might not even know. Culture freezes. Instead of creating new forms of art and thought, winter civilizations endlessly recycle the past. Museums and universities preserve what came before but produce little that's genuinely new. Architecture imitates older styles because nobody can imagine anything original. Music becomes either commercial product or academic exercise. Literature fragments into 1,000 subgenres, none of them saying anything that matters. Most unsettling, people lose the capacity for grand projects. The civilization that once built cathedrals and conquered continents becomes cautious, risk-averse, obsessed with comfort and safety. Not because people are weaker, but because the animating spirit is gone. The sense of destiny and purpose that drove earlier generations has evaporated. All that's left is the desire to maintain what exists and extract whatever personal pleasure you can from a world that no longer makes sense. Spengler predicted all this would happen to the West starting in the 20th century and accelerating through the 21st. He wrote this in 1918, remember? Before the World Wars, before the Cold War, before the Internet, before any of the specific developments we now associate with late Western civilization. He was working from pattern recognition alone, looking at how previous civilizations had died and projecting those patterns onto his own. Academic historians largely dismissed him. Too deterministic, they said. Too pessimistic. Civilizations don't have to decline. We can learn from history, adapt, reform our institutions. Progress isn't inevitable, but neither is collapse. Besides, Spengler's categories were too neat, too schematic. Real history is messier than his Four Seasons model suggests, but others kept reading him, kept noticing that his winter looked increasingly familiar. The materialism, the spiritual emptiness, the plutocracy masquerading as democracy, the inability to create meaningful art, the endless recycling of past styles, the rise of megacities full of atomized individuals, the politics becoming spectacle while real power operates in shadows. Everything he described, we see around us, not perfectly, not in every detail, but the pattern is there. Unmistakable once you know to look for it. So here's the question that keeps people awake at night. Was Spengler right? Are we living through the winter of Western civilization? The final season before something new emerges, or before everything collapses into chaos? Because Spengler was clear about one thing. Winter doesn't last forever. Eventually the civilization dies completely. Its forms persist for a while, like the Western Roman Empire persisted for centuries after its vital spirit was gone, but ultimately it ends, and something else begins. The haunting thing is that nobody inside a dying civilization can see clearly what's happening. You're too close, too embedded in the forms and assumptions. To people in late Rome, it probably felt like Rome would last forever. Despite all the obvious problems, the institutions were still there. The laws, the infrastructure, the identity. How could Rome end? It was eternal by definition, but it did end. And if Spengler was right, if his pattern recognition was accurate, then the West is ending too. Not tomorrow, not in any sudden catastrophic moment, but slowly, across generations. We're living through the long goodbye of the seventh civilization. The question is what comes next. Because something always comes next. Winter is the death of one world and the hidden pregnancy of another. Arnold Toynbee spent most of his adult life obsessed with a single question. Why do civilizations die? Not just collapse from invasion or plague or natural disaster, but actually lose the capacity to continue existing as themselves. Between 1934 and 1961, he produced 12 volumes totaling over 7,000 pages, examining 23 civilizations across all of human history. The work was called A Study of History, and it remains one of the most ambitious intellectual projects of the 20th century. Toynbee wasn't interested in cataloguing dates and dynasties. He wanted to find the pattern, the underlying mechanism that determined whether a civilization would thrive or wither, and he believed he found it. He called it challenge and response. The theory is elegant in its simplicity. Civilizations don't emerge in perfect conditions. They arise in places where survival requires innovation. A harsh environment, hostile neighbors, geographical isolation. These aren't obstacles to civilization. They're the fuel. When a human society faces a challenge that's difficult but not impossible to overcome, something remarkable can happen. The society responds, not just with brute force or simple adaptation, but with genuine creativity. New technologies, new forms of social organization, new ways of thinking about problems. The response transforms the society, makes it more complex, more capable, more civilized. The key word is creativity. Toynbee observed that in every rising civilization, there's what he called a creative minority, a group of leaders, thinkers, innovators who come up with novel solutions to existential problems. And here's the crucial part. The rest of society follows them voluntarily, not because they're forced to, but because the solutions actually work, because the creative minority inspires genuine admiration and trust. The Athenian democracy responding to Persian invasion by building a navy and inventing a new form of naval warfare. Medieval European monasteries preserving knowledge and developing agricultural innovations during centuries of chaos. Chinese civilization responding to the challenge of unifying vast territories by developing sophisticated bureaucratic systems. In each case, creative responses to genuine challenges drove civilizational growth. But then something shifts. The civilization succeeds. The original challenge is overcome. The creative minority becomes entrenched, institutionalized. They're no longer creative. They're now what Toynbee called a dominant minority. They still hold power, still give orders, but they've stopped innovating. They're coasting on past achievements, applying old solutions to new problems. More importantly, they've stopped inspiring voluntary cooperation. Now they maintain control through force, through institutional inertia, through manipulation rather than genuine leadership. The rest of society sees this. They stop believing. They stop following willingly, and the civilization begins its long fall. Toynbee identified what happens next with disturbing precision. As faith in the dominant minority collapses, society fractures into what he called the internal proletariat and the external proletariat. These terms sound Marxist, and Toynbee was definitely influenced by Marx, but his meaning is different. The internal proletariat isn't just the poor or working class. It's everyone within the civilization who no longer believes in its institutions, who no longer feels spiritually or emotionally connected to its values. They're physically inside the civilization but psychologically alienated from it. They go through the motions, pay their taxes, follow the laws when they have to, but they've withdrawn their genuine participation. They're waiting for something else, something better, some new idea that might actually inspire them again. The external proletariat is everyone outside the civilization's borders who sees its weakness. Barbarian tribes who've been watching the empire from beyond the frontier, neighboring civilizations who sense opportunity, internal groups who've been marginalized and are ready to break away. They begin pressing inward, testing the boundaries, launching raids that grow bolder as the civilization's response grows weaker. The pattern appears again and again. Rome facing Germanic tribes and Persian rivals, while its own citizens lost faith in Roman ideals. The Abbasid Caliphate fragmenting as Turkish and Mongol warriors pushed in from Central Asia, while internal populations developed competing identities. The British Empire dissolving as colonized peoples demanded independence, while Britons themselves questioned whether empire was even worth maintaining. According to Toynbee, civilizations die because they stop responding creatively to new challenges. The institutions that solved yesterday's problems become obstacles to solving tomorrow's. The leadership that once inspired now merely dominates, and the society fractures into those who've given up on the system and those outside who are ready to replace it. But here's where Toynbee went somewhere most historians wouldn't follow. He argued that this entire process serves a purpose, that civilizations exist not as ends in themselves, but as crucibles for spiritual development. Every major world religion, he observed, emerged from the death throes of an older civilization. Christianity from the collapse of classical civilization, Buddhism from the fragmentation of ancient Indian kingdoms, Islam from the chaos following the decline of Byzantine and Persian power. The suffering of civilizational breakdown creates the psychological conditions for spiritual breakthrough. People searching for meaning beyond failed institutions, seeking something transcendent, something that might outlast the temporary structures of power and culture. This is where Toynbee became controversial, even among historians who admired his analytical framework. He suggested that civilizations are essentially vehicles for generating higher spiritual consciousness. They rise, accomplish their cultural and technological achievements, then break down specifically so that a new spiritual vision can emerge from the ruins. The eighth civilization, by this logic, wouldn't just be a new arrangement of political and economic structures. It would be accompanied by a new spiritual understanding, a new way of conceptualizing humanity's relationship to existence itself. Looking at our present moment through Toynbee's framework is unsettling. Are we watching a dominant minority desperately clinging to power through increasingly authoritarian means? Is the widespread alienation across political spectrums evidence of an emerging internal proletariat? Are the various forces pressing against Western hegemony, economic, military, cultural, evidence of an external proletariat sensing weakness? Most importantly, are our institutions still capable of creative response to genuinely novel challenges? Climate change, artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, social media's effects on cognition, these aren't problems our current systems were designed to handle. The question isn't whether we face challenges. We obviously do. The question is whether our civilization can still respond with genuine creativity, or whether we've become a dominant minority applying obsolete solutions while society fragments around us. Toynbee would say, the answer lies not in our technology or military power, but in something simpler and more profound. Can we still inspire people to believe, to voluntarily participate, to feel that our civilization's story is their story? When the answer becomes no, the ending has already begun. History, in this view, doesn't just move forward in a straight line. It breathes. It inhales and exhales. It tightens and releases. And sometimes, without anyone quite realizing it, it reaches a breaking point and starts over in a new key. In the late 20th century, two American historians, William Strauss and Neil Howe, tried to map this breathing pattern, not across thousands of years, but across just a few human lifetimes. They argued that if you zoom in on a single society, like the United States, you don't just see the rise and fall of empires, you see smaller, repeating waves, about as long as a long human life, 80 to 100 years, a span they called a saeculum. According to them, each saeculum isn't random. It's composed of 4 predictable seasons of history, which they called turnings. Each turning lasts roughly 20 years, long enough for a new generation to grow up inside it. These 4 turnings repeat in order, over and over: high, awakening, unraveling, crisis. Then, if the society survives the storm, a new high begins, and the whole cycle starts again. The first turning, the high, is the spring after a storm. Institutions are strong. People trust their leaders more than they distrust them. There's a sense of collective purpose. You're born into a world that feels organized, disciplined, a little conformist. Your parents talk about sacrifice, duty, rebuilding. The air is full of we, not me. But that very order plants seeds of rebellion. The second turning is the awakening. The generation that grows up inside the high comes of age and begins to push back. Institutions feel stifling now, not protective. Spiritual hunger grows. People start asking big questions. What does it mean to live authentically? Is there more to life than material comfort? Movements arise that challenge the official story. Old certainties begin to crack, not because the system is failing materially, but because it's failing spiritually. The third turning is the unraveling. What once felt like cracks widen into fractures. Institutions weaken. Trust erodes. The grand narratives that held society together start to dissolve. Cynicism becomes normal. You're born into a world where people expect things to be rigged, where every ideal seems compromised. The energy that once went into building common institutions now spills into individual identity, niche culture, private meaning. The we shatters into a million eyes. Then comes the fourth turning, the crisis. This is the winter of the cycle. In Strauss and Howe's model, this is when all the accumulated dysfunction, all the unresolved tensions from the previous seasons, finally collide. Institutions fail or are forced to transform. Conflicts that have been simmering for decades boil over. Economic systems break down. Political structures are rewritten. Wars erupt or revolutions. A society faces an ultimatum: adapt or shatter. Each turning shapes the generation born into it. Children of the high grow up in safety and order. They tend to become the energetic, individualistic young adults who fuel the awakening. Children of the awakening grow up amid spiritual turmoil and cultural experimentation. They tend to crave structure and become the institution builders of the next high. Those born in the unraveling often become cautious, pragmatic adults who try to manage the chaos of the crisis. And those born into the crisis itself grow up fast. They learn early what it means to live through historic disruption. They become the ones who will either rebuild or remember what was lost. Strauss and Howe took this pattern of 4 turnings and laid it across American history. The fit, at least on the surface, is unsettling. They pointed to the American Revolution as one crisis. Roughly from the 1770s through the 1790s, the old colonial order was torn apart. A new political system, a new national identity, new institutions were hammered out under fire. About 80 years later, another crisis, the the Civil War era. From the 1860s through the 1870s, the country nearly disintegrated. Slavery, federal versus state power, the very definition of the Union, all resolved only through unimaginable bloodshed and a rewritten constitution. Roughly another 80 years, and a third crisis, the Great Depression and the Second World War. From the early 1930s into the mid-1940s, the global economic system collapsed, totalitarian regimes rose, and the world order was remade. When it was over, new institutions dominated life. The United Nations, Bretton Woods finance, the American-led international system. A fresh high followed, the optimistic post-war age that many people now remember as the golden years. 3 great national winters, 3 times that the United States was forced into a life-or-death confrontation with itself and its circumstances, and 3 times that, out of the wreckage, a new institutional order emerged. Then Strauss and Howe did something risky. In 1997, they published a book called The Fourth Turning. In it, they argued that the pattern pointed toward another crisis, another winter. Based on their timeline, they suggested that America would enter this new fourth turning sometime in the first decade of the 2000s. Somewhere between 2005 and 2025, they wrote, the country would pass through a period of escalating turmoil. They didn't claim to know the exact trigger. Terrorism, financial collapse, political breakdown, war, some unexpected shock, but they believed the structural conditions would converge. Institutions hollowed out, trust decayed, a generation of young people coming of age in instability, a society forced into a choice, transform or be transformed. Looking back now, from our vantage point, it's hard not to feel a chill. Since the early 2000s, the United States and much of the world has been shaken repeatedly. Terrorist attacks, endless wars, the 2008 financial crisis, rising inequality, political polarization, insurgent movements on both left and right, a global pandemic, supply chain breakdowns, intensifying climate disasters, and a general sense that the center is no longer holding. We don't yet know what historians will call this era, but we can feel that we are living inside something, a long grinding stress test, a passage. Strauss and Howe would argue that this is the unnamed crisis, the winter of our current saeculum, the moment when the post-World War II order, with its institutions and assumptions, either renews itself in a new form or gives way to something entirely different. The implications are uncomfortable. If they were right, we are not just in a bad patch that will soon return to normal. We are in the climactic phase of a cycle that has appeared before, in other guises. And cycles like this do not end with a gentle taper. They end with decisive resolution, sometimes constructive, sometimes catastrophic. Critics point out that patterns can be found anywhere if you look hard enough. Human beings are storytellers. We love cycles, archetypes, neat packages. History, in reality, is messy. There are always events that don't fit, always anomalies. Strauss-Howe's timelines can be stretched or squeezed. Their generational archetypes can feel vague or forced. Their predictions are not prophecies. They are frameworks, possibilities. But that's where the deeper connection to civilizational cycles becomes intriguing. Because if the rise and fall of civilizations is the Great Wheel, spanning centuries or millennia, then these generational cycles are like smaller gears turning inside it. Every civilization's grand arc is made up of living people, each shaped by the mood of their birth era. The children of a high become the mystics and rebels of an awakening, the disillusioned adults of an unraveling, the hardened survivors of a crisis. Their choices add up. Their collective moods harden into politics, economies, wars, and renaissances. In Toynbee's language, civilizations face challenges and respond or fail to. In Strauss and Howe's language, Each seculum stores up unresolved tensions until a crisis forces a response. Combine these views and you get a picture of history as nested cycles, the long waves of civilizations rising and falling, the shorter waves of generations creating, questioning, fragmenting and rebuilding, wheels within wheels, patterns within patterns. And if the eighth civilization truly is beginning to stir, as some suspect, it will not rise in a vacuum. It will emerge from inside a fourth turning, forged by a generation that grew up knowing only instability, fed up with the decay of old systems, hungry, perhaps desperate for something new. Every civilization thinks it is different. The Romans thought the eternal city could never truly fall. The late Ming court believed that 4,000 years of Chinese history guaranteed some kind of continuity, no matter how bad things got. The elites of the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad were still writing sophisticated poetry right up until the Mongols arrived at the gates. From the inside, decline rarely feels like a clean break. It feels like normal life, getting just a little bit harder, a little bit stranger year after year. But when you zoom out, when you look across the first 7 civilizations as if they were layers in a geological core, something unnerving appears. Certain symptoms show up again and again when a civilization moves from late maturity into true old age. Not the ordinary ups and downs, not the recessions and crises that healthy societies can recover from, but the slow-motion signs of something deeper failing. Economy, society, culture, politics, they all begin to fray in oddly similar ways. Not identical, not like a script being followed, but like variations on a theme that keeps recurring across thousands of years. Start with money, because money is never just money. It is trust, condensed into metal, paper, or digits. In nearly every terminal phase you see some version of currency rot. In Rome, it was literal. Silver coins quietly thinned with cheaper metals. Emperors shaving value off the denarius to pay legions and buy loyalty. In late Byzantium, the famous gold numisma, once trusted across continents, was debased until its reputation collapsed. In the last days of several Chinese dynasties, emperors flooded the market with paper notes, promising future wealth that never arrived. You see the same pattern of promises outrunning reality. States borrow more than they can ever reasonably repay. Debts are rolled over, extended, disguised with clever accounting tricks. Elites close to the center of power profit from this confusion, while everyone else watches the real value of their savings evaporate. Wealth itself begins to pool instead of circulate. Land in late Rome concentrates in massive estates, while small farmers are crushed by taxes and debt. In late Bourbon France, a tiny fraction of the population owns almost everything that matters. In the waning Ottoman Empire, a narrow elite captures key concessions, monopolies and contracts, while public finances buckle. At the same time, the bones of the civilization, its infrastructure, quietly start to fail. Roads and bridges that once symbolized imperial power fall into disrepair, because maintenance isn't glamorous and doesn't win factional struggles at court. Aqueducts clog, ports silt up, flood defences that used to be meticulously maintained become somebody else's problem. The grand projects still get built, usually as monuments to prestige, but the everyday systems that keep ordinary life running grow brittle. Economically, this is what old age looks like. Increasingly fragile complexity held together by improvisation, short-term fixes and wishful bookkeeping. Then there are the social signs. These are less visible in stone and metal, but you can trace them in letters, in laws, in the quiet complaints of people who never knew they were witnessing the end of an era. One of the strangest, most consistent symptoms is declining birth rates among the very groups that once drove expansion. In late Republican and Imperial Rome, laws are passed to encourage elite families to have more children, because they're not replacing themselves. In Tokugawa, Japan's later centuries, Village records show families shrinking. In several late dynastic periods in China, the wealthy urban classes delay marriage and limit offspring, while poorer rural populations carry the demographic burden. At the same time, social cohesion weakens. Shared rituals that once bound cities and villages together lose their emotional force. Festivals become more about spectacle than meaning. Loyalty shifts from the larger whole, empire, church, kingdom, to narrower identities, clan, sect, faction, class. You see more people retreating into private worlds. Hermits and ascetics in late classical India, scholar officials withdrawing from court in late Ming China, Roman aristocrats writing philosophy on their estates while the frontiers burn. The sense that we are part of a great common project starts to fade. It becomes they, those people in the capital, those other tribes, those other parties. Values that once seemed obvious start to erode. In the Roman world, civic duty and military service gradually give way to personal enrichment and survival. In late medieval Europe, open complaints about church corruption multiply, not from rebels on the margins, but from within the clergy itself. People still use the old words, virtue, honour, piety, patriotism, but the shared understanding of what those words mean begins to splinter. Culturally, civilizations in decline rarely go quiet. In fact, they often become louder, more self-conscious, more obsessed with themselves. Art turns inward. Instead of bursting with new symbols and myths, it starts quoting itself. Late Roman literature is full of references to earlier, greater authors. Byzantine mosaics echo classical forms long after the living culture behind those forms has faded. In the dying days of the Abbasid Caliphate, scholars produce massive encyclopedias, commentaries on commentaries, exquisite, intricate, but mostly rearranging existing knowledge. The grand narratives that once animated the civilization, the manifest destiny of Rome, the heavenly mandate of Chinese dynasties, the universal mission of the caliphate or the church, start to feel tired. People still mouth the formulas, but fewer actually believe that their world is on an upward path, that the future will be bigger, brighter, more meaningful than the past. Instead, you see an obsession with earlier golden ages. Romans venerate the Republic long after it's gone. The late Ottomans dream of Suleiman's time while their actual empire shrinks. Artists, architects and writers keep reaching backward, reviving older styles, staging nostalgic revivals, polishing the memory of past greatness instead of imagining truly new futures. Politically, the symptoms are even starker. Institutions that once seemed almost invincible begin to malfunction in ways that everyone can see but no one can fix. Laws are still written, decrees still issued, parliaments or councils still meet, but decisions get slower, more contradictory, more obviously driven by short-term survival rather than long-term vision. In late Rome, emperors rotate so quickly that soldiers joke about selling the throne to the highest bidder. In the French monarchy before the Revolution, attempts at reform are blocked again and again by privileged groups who fear losing even a fraction of their advantages. Legitimacy frays. People obey because they have to, not because they believe. Conspiracy theories flourish in this environment, some justified, most not. Rumours of betrayal, of hidden cabals, of secret decay at the top become part of everyday conversation. Trust in official narratives collapses. Into this vacuum step strongmen, or at least figures who promise to cut through the paralysis. Late Roman history is a parade of military saviours. The final centuries of many Chinese dynasties see regional warlords effectively running their own mini-states. Even when the constitutional surface remains intact, more power is exercised informally through personal networks, money, and force rather than through the old, elaborate procedures. Basic problems remain unsolved. tax systems everyone hates but no one reforms, border crises that drag on for decades, urban crime that becomes routine. Each issue is recognised, studied, debated, and then kicked down the road, because any real solution would threaten too many entrenched interests. Looking at all this, it's tempting to draw a straight line from then to now, to point at our own world's debt levels, demographic shifts, cultural fragmentation, political deadlock, and declare that we are obviously in the same terminal phase. Some thinkers do exactly that. Others argue that we are pattern matching, seeing faces in clouds, forcing very different situations into one dramatic narrative of decline. The truth is probably somewhere in between. Human beings are excellent at spotting patterns, even when those patterns are only half real. But it is also true that civilizations are made of human brains, human bodies, human institutions, and those have certain limits, certain failure modes that show up repeatedly across history. So when we notice echoes in our economies, in our social fabric, in our art and politics, they don't prove that collapse is inevitable. They do, however, raise a question worth staying awake with or falling asleep to. If these are indeed the symptoms of civilizational old age, what happens next? Do all roads lead to ruin, or is there something stranger waiting on the other side of decline? Because if the pattern holds, death is rarely just an ending. It is also the space in which something new begins to take shape. History remembers the great empires, the golden ages, the philosophers and conquerors and glittering cities. But in between those bright peaks there are valleys, long stretches of time that later generations dismiss with a single phrase: the Dark Ages. As if a curtain dropped on civilization and nothing worth remembering happened until someone decided to invent the Renaissance. But if you zoom in on those so-called dark periods, if you stop looking at them from the safe distance of a textbook timeline, and instead imagine what it felt like to live through them day by day, the picture changes. They're not pure darkness, they're twilight, unsettling, confusing, but also strangely fertile. Old constellations of power fade from view, and faint new stars begin to appear. The most famous of these twilight zones is the one between the Roman world and medieval Europe. Popular imagination treats it like a light switch. One day, Rome rules the Mediterranean, aqueducts flow, legions march, law and order stretch from Britain to North Africa. The next day, barbarians sack the city, everything collapses, and suddenly everyone's living in mud huts, forgetting how to read. But that's not how it happened. Rome didn't fall in a single moment of catastrophe. It dissolved. Slowly, unevenly, over centuries. If you were born in the Western Empire in the 3rd or 4th century, you would have grown up in a world where things mostly still worked. The taxes were heavy, the politics unstable, but the idea of Rome, the system of Rome, still held. Roads were maintained. Grain ships still crossed the Mediterranean. Latin law courts still operated in distant provinces. But under the surface, the supports were rotting. Trade networks shrank as piracy and insecurity made long-distance commerce riskier. Cities that had depended on imported grain began to hollow out when those shipments became irregular. Armies that had once been citizen legions turned into patchwork forces of mercenaries, often recruited from the very barbarian groups they were supposed to repel. Gold coinage thinned, then disappeared from everyday circulation. People started hoarding. Trust in institutions frayed. For a long time, though, daily life didn't look like the end of a civilization. It looked like annoying decline, higher taxes, more corrupt officials, less reliable markets, a little more danger on the roads each year, the sense that your children might not have it quite as good as your parents did. Uncomfortable, but not apocalyptic. Then, gradually, the changes that had been accumulating for generations crossed invisible thresholds. Regional strongmen began to matter more than distant emperors. Local identities, Goth, Frank, Burgundian, started to outweigh the old universal identity of Roman. Provincial governors who once saw themselves as servants of a continental empire began acting like kings of their own small worlds. Laws changed, languages shifted. Not overnight, but step by step, so slowly that if you were living through it, you might not notice the moment when Roman stopped being the default setting of reality. For some people, this transition meant disaster. If you depended on imperial bureaucracy, long-distance trade, or the protection of the legions, your world simply stopped working. Cities like Trier, once administrative hubs, shrank to towns. Great villas were abandoned. Public baths went cold. In some regions, literacy fell off a cliff because the economic and political structures that had made reading useful no longer existed. From a distant historical perspective, this looks like collapse, and it was. But collapse is only half the story. At the very same time that imperial systems were disintegrating, new systems were quietly forming. In the hills and valleys of Western Europe, monasteries began to appear. At first, they were small experiments in religious life, groups of people trying to live apart from the corruption of the world. But as the old Roman frameworks crumbled, these isolated communities took on new roles. They became islands of continuity. Monasteries copied texts because they believed knowledge was sacred. They preserved not just religious writings, but also fragments of Roman law, philosophy, medical treatises, agricultural manuals. In a world where many people no longer knew how to read, monks and nuns became the memory keepers of a vanished civilization. They also developed practical skills. They experimented with crops, improved viticulture, managed forests, organized labor. Their routines were stable, predictable, almost immune to the chaos outside their walls. To a peasant living through constant war and land disputes, a monastery could seem like another planet. Quiet, ordered, timeless. At the same time, trade didn't vanish. It rerouted. The grand Mediterranean-wide networks of the Roman era withered, yes, but local and regional trade continued, and in some places actually intensified. River routes became crucial. Small market towns grew where roads and waterways intersected. New elites emerged, not as imperial officials, but as warrior chiefs and landlords, making deals with merchants, taxing crossings, minting their own coins. In the wreckage of Roman centralization, new webs of obligation and opportunity formed. Isolated communities played their part too. Mountain villages, remote islands, pockets of territory no one bothered to conquer, these became accidental arcs. They preserved dialects, farming practices, stories, even legal customs that had disappeared everywhere else. When stability eventually returned, those scraps of continuity could be stitched into new cultural fabrics. This is the pattern you see again and again in history's interregnums, the periods between civilizations. Old structures lose legitimacy. Institutions that once seemed eternal become brittle, start cracking under their own weight. People lose faith in systems that no longer deliver what they promise. On the surface, it looks like everything is breaking. Underneath, something else is happening. Breakdown before breakthrough. The fall of the Western Roman Empire set the stage for medieval Europe. The fragmentation of medieval feudal structures set the stage for the Renaissance and the early modern world. The shock of the Black Death, which killed up to half the population in some regions, shattered the old order of labour and land, but it also led to higher wages, new experiments in technology, and eventually shifts in thought that would help birth modern science. From far away in hindsight, we compress these long transitions into simple labels: Dark Age, Crisis Era, Time of Troubles. But if you could talk to someone living through them, the labels would feel cruelly inadequate. To them, it would feel like constant uncertainty. The rules changing every decade, laws rewritten, rulers replaced, borders redrawn, currencies debased, then replaced, religious certainties questioned, then enforced more harshly, then questioned again. A sense that the map inside your head never quite matches the territory beneath your feet. It would feel like fear, rumours of invading armies, of plague in the next town, of taxes you can't pay, of famine if the rain doesn't come. Stories that the world was better before you never actually remember, because it belonged to your grandparents' time. But it would also strangely feel like possibility. In interregnums, roles are less fixed. A clever merchant might rise faster than a noble whose ancestors once mattered more than he does. A small monastery in a forgotten valley might accumulate land, influence and books, slowly turning into a regional power. A new idea about God, or law, or the rights of common people might spread in whispered conversations because there is no longer a single authority strong enough to stamp it out everywhere at once. Transitions are chaotic, but they are also creative. They are moments when the old answers no longer work, but new answers have not yet solidified into dogma. When history takes a deep, unsettling breath, our memories of these ages are distorted by survivor's bias. We remember the institutions that made it through, the texts that were copied, the cities that rose again. We forget the thousands of experiments that failed, the countless lives lived in the fog between stories, no longer truly Roman, not yet truly medieval. Yet those liminal generations are the hinge on which everything turns. If civilizations are like great forests, then the interregnum is the wildfire, and the first green shoots afterward. Terrifying up close, cleansing in the longest view, a phase where old growth burns, dead wood clears, and seeds that have waited in the soil for decades finally get their chance to sprout. We're used to thinking of civilization as a steady climb, but the pattern written in history's forgotten centuries suggests something stranger. We climb, we plateau, we fracture, we fall, and in the ruins, someone, somewhere, is quietly building the monastery, the market town, the idea that will define the next age. Historians and futurists have been trying to guess where that next wave will crest. Some point to maps, some point to markets. Others say the whole idea of a centre is about to dissolve, and like those tiny bands of humans at the bottleneck, scattered yet connected, the seeds of the eighth civilization may not all be in one place. They may be spread across the planet, waiting for the right conditions to erupt. One of the oldest candidates is also one of the most obvious, East Asia, and especially China. China's own historians have been thinking in cycles for thousands of years. Dynasties rise, consolidate power, build great works, then fall into corruption and fragmentation. The mandate of heaven is lost, chaos spreads, and from the wreckage a new order emerges. Rinse, repeat, over and over, for more than 2 millennia. To someone steeped in that pattern, the idea that the West might be entering its autumn, while China is moving back into a spring, feels less like prophecy and more like common sense. The sheer scale is hard to ignore. A population in the billions, a manufacturing base that supplies half the world, technological sectors sprinting from imitation to innovation, a state apparatus that thinks in terms of decades and centuries, not election cycles. If Spengler was right that cultures have distinct souls, then the Chinese civilizational soul has survived conquest, disunity, foreign invasion, and ideological revolution. Each time, something recognizably Chinese persisted on the other side. Written characters, core philosophies, ancestral rituals, the deep respect for order and learning. It's not hard to imagine an eighth civilization that looks less like a brand new invention and more like a reconfiguration of a very old pattern, scaled to the planet and augmented by digital tools. But there's another theory that says the real story won't be about one country, but about a corridor. Look at a satellite map of Eurasia at night. A glowing band stretches from coastal China through Central Asia, into the Middle East, and on toward Europe. That's the rough outline of one of the oldest civilizational arteries in human history, the Silk Road. For thousands of years, it wasn't just silk and spices that moved along those routes. It was religions, technologies, genes, and ideas. Buddhism spreading from India to China, gunpowder moving from China to Europe, plagues travelling in the other direction. Some scholars think the next civilization won't be Chinese or European, but Eurasian, a fusion zone stitched together by infrastructure. Trains, pipelines, fibre optic cables, shipping routes. The modern name for this idea is the Belt and Road Initiative, but the concept is much older. Create a continuous economic and cultural space across the world's largest landmass and see what emerges. From this perspective, the Belt and Road isn't just a trade project, it's potential civilizational scaffolding. Ports in Africa tied to factories in China and consumer markets in Europe, energy flowing from Central Asia, data flowing through undersea cables, people moving along new highways where caravans once walked. If civilizations are, at their core, networks of exchange and meaning, then a reconnected Eurasia could function like a single, gigantic nervous system. Of course there are problems, rivalries, debts, resistance, local cultures that don't want to be flattened. The system could break apart before it coheres, or it could knit together just enough to create something new, a hybrid civilization that doesn't fit neatly into past categories, with a shared infrastructure but competing value systems jostling for dominance inside it. And then there's the more radical possibility that the eighth civilization won't have a clear geographical centre at all. For most of history, you could point to a map and say, there, that's the core, the Nile Valley, the Italian peninsula, the Yellow River Basin, the imperial capital and its surrounding heartland. But what happens when the real action moves into the networks that wrap around the globe? When someone in Lagos collaborates daily with someone in Sao Paulo, Bangalore and Berlin, all inside virtual spaces that barely care about borders? Some futurists think we're drifting toward cloud civilizations, loose, overlapping communities defined less by territory and more by shared platforms, currencies, languages and values. A gamer in Indonesia might feel more at home in their online guild than in their village. A programmer in Nairobi might belong more to the open source movement than to their national politics. A startup founder in Estonia might be more plugged into Silicon Valley's mental world than into old European institutions. In this view, the seeds of the eighth civilization are scattered nodes, digital communities, transnational movements, remote-first companies, global fandoms, online universities, decentralized organizations. None of them by themselves look like a civilization, just as a single band of 30 humans in the bottleneck didn't look like the future of the species. But connected together, exchanging knowledge at high speed, they might be laying down something like civilizational DNA. And here technology stops being just a tool and starts looking suspiciously like an evolutionary mechanism. Artificial intelligence, blockchain, always-on connectivity, these aren't just gadgets. They shape how we coordinate, how we trust, how we remember. AI systems are slowly becoming part of our collective problem-solving apparatus, like extra lobes of a distributed brain. Blockchains and similar technologies are experimenting with new ways to create trust without centralized authorities, like strange new social chromosomes trying to stabilize themselves. Social media and messaging apps have already rewired the global flow of information more thoroughly than the printing press ever did. If earlier civilizations were defined by their control of energy, irrigation, bronze, steam, oil, the eighth might be defined by control of information. Who sees what, when, and with what filters? Who can participate in which networks? Who can create new systems instead of just living inside existing ones? But a civilization isn't only infrastructure and intelligence. It also has a soul, a set of stories and values that answer the questions technology can't. What is a good life? What is a just society? Who belongs? And why? Under the noise of politics and markets, new spiritual and philosophical currents are quietly circulating. A renewed interest in meditation and contemplative traditions from Buddhism, Taoism and Hinduism. A surge of ecological awareness that treats the earth less like a warehouse and more like a living system. Experiments with psychedelics that some people believe open doors to older, perhaps forgotten layers of human consciousness. A growing fascination with systems thinking, complexity and interdependence. These currents don't all agree with each other. Some are deeply religious, others fiercely secular. Some look backward to ancient wisdom, others forward to post-human futures. But they share a few themes. The sense that hyper-individualism has gone too far. The intuition that we're entangled with each other and with our environment in ways our current institutions barely understand. The feeling that meaning can't be reduced to consumption, nor identity to nationality. Maybe the eighth civilization's soul will be forged somewhere in this swirl. A synthesis that hasn't quite crystallized yet. Part Eastern introspection, part Western scientific rigor, part indigenous respect for land, part digital age awareness of networks and systems, or maybe multiple souls will compete for dominance inside the same global shell, like different cultural lineages sharing the same technological skeleton. We don't know. We can't know. Just as those scattered bands of bottleneck survivors had no way of imagining Neanderthals, Denisovans and modern humans, we can't fully picture what an eighth civilization will feel like from the inside. We can only trace the hints, the infrastructure of a new Silk Road, the gravitational pull of East Asia, ghostly outlines of cloud societies, the strange new intelligences blinking to life in our machines, quiet hunger for a different kind of meaning. Somewhere in that tangle, the next pattern is forming. For most of human history, technology changed the world slowly, like a river carving a canyon grain by grain. You might be born into one way of living and die in roughly the same one. The plough, the sail, the wheel, bronze, iron, each mattered. But they unfolded over centuries, even millennia. What's happening now is different. We're living through a transition where technology doesn't just change our tools, it's starting to change the very substrate of civilization itself, the way DNA encodes the body. Only this time the DNA isn't biological, it's digital. To see how strange this is, you have to go back to the first time information itself became a technology. Writing appears late in the story of civilization. For tens of thousands of years humans had language, memory and ritual, but no writing. Knowledge lived in people's heads, in stories repeated around fires, in songs and ceremonies. When someone died, a library went with them. Then, around 5,000 years ago, in a few different places, humans did something unprecedented. They started to trap language in clay and stone. At first, it was boring stuff. Grain tallies, tax records, names of kings. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, writing mutated into something else. Law codes, contracts, letters, myths, mathematics. Writing didn't just record civilization, it reorganized it. Once you can store information outside the human brain, you can create bureaucracies that last longer than any one ruler. You can coordinate armies, collect taxes, standardize weights and measures. You can govern people you will never meet. In a sense, writing became the DNA of the first great civilizations. It encoded their laws, their myths, their lineages, their debts. It allowed a king's orders to outlive his breath, a priest's doctrine to outlast her lifetime. It made possible what had been impossible. Large, stable, hierarchical societies with memory that stretched beyond oral tradition. Then, thousands of years later, another information mutation arrived. the printing press. For centuries, writing was powerful, but rare. Scribes were like genetic engineers of culture, carefully copying manuscripts by hand, one by one. Most people would never own a book. Many would never see one. Gutenberg changed that. With movable type, information could replicate almost like a virus. A text in one city could be duplicated in another, and another, and another, with a speed that would have seemed supernatural a century earlier. The printing press did to medieval Europe what the bottleneck did to early humans. It compressed and then exploded the possibilities. Religious ideas that would once have died in a village sermon became pamphlets spreading across continents. Scientific observations could be shared, replicated, challenged. Political manifestos circulated among people who had never held power before. Printing didn't just make books cheaper, it rewired the mental and social structures of an entire civilization. It helped birth the Reformation, the scientific revolution, the Enlightenment, mass literacy, and eventually modern democracy. It created an environment where information could compete, adapt, and evolve faster than the institutions trying to control it. Each of these information revolutions, writing, printing, did the same fundamental thing. They changed how humans organized themselves. They changed what a civilization could be. Now we're in the middle of a third transformation, one that makes both writing and printing look almost quaint. Digital technology doesn't just record information, it copies it instantly, globally, almost without cost. It doesn't just store ideas. Increasingly, it processes them, rearranges them, generates new ones. For the first time, the DNA of civilization isn't locked in stone tablets or shelves of books. It's fluid, networked, searchable. It lives in servers, fiber optic cables, wireless signals. It can be backed up, forked, remixed, erased. And it doesn't just live in one place. It flows continuously through billions of devices, through the pockets and palms and retinas of almost every human on Earth. Some theorists call this the emergence of a global brain. The idea is simple, but unsettling. A brain is a network of cells that share information, firing, synchronizing, strengthening some connections and letting others die away. Humanity now has billions of cells, individual humans, linked by digital networks that transmit signals at near-light speed. Search engines function like collective memory. Social media acts like an emotional nervous system, amplifying fear, anger, joy. Cloud servers store the long-term memories of companies, governments, families, individuals. Algorithms route attention the way neurons route signals. No one is in charge of this global brain. No single mind designs its thoughts, and yet, in a loose, chaotic way, it learns. Viral ideas evolve, movements coalesce, entire industries appear and vanish, patterns emerge from the noise. If previous civilizations were like separate organisms, the eighth might be something stranger. A planetary-scale nervous system, a distributed consciousness made of carbon and code, that's the hopeful version. The darker version is that we're not building a global brain. We're building a global panopticon. The same networks that connect us also watch us. Every message, every click, every movement with a phone in your pocket can, in theory, be tracked, logged, analyzed. Data becomes a new kind of power, subtle and invisible, capable of predicting and nudging behavior on a scale no ancient empire could dream of. Parents in early agricultural villages might have known what their children were doing most of the day. Modern systems can know what entire populations are doing, thinking and feeling second by second. This opens doors that are hard to close. Mass surveillance, algorithmic control, social credit systems, targeted propaganda so personalized it feels like your own thoughts. In older civilizations, control depended on visible force, soldiers, prisons, public executions. In a digital civilization, control can be almost frictionless. No chains, just nudges, just recommendations, just a quiet reshaping of what you see and what you never even know existed. And hovering over all of this is a new and deeply controversial possibility that the next creative minority, the group that defines the direction of the new civilization, might not be fully human at all. In Toynbee's model, civilizations advance when a creative minority comes up with new responses to challenges, new religions, new political systems, new technologies, new art forms. These minorities inspire imitation, and their solutions become the blueprint for an era. But what happens when some of the most powerful creative acts, designing drugs, optimizing logistics, writing code, composing music, generating ideas, are done by artificial intelligences? Already, algorithms decide what millions of people watch, read, and listen to. Machine learning models help design new materials, new treatments, new strategies. They're not conscious in any human sense, as far as we know. But they are participating in the creation of our future. At some point, the question may not be, will AI replace humans, but something subtler. Will AI become a core part of how civilization thinks? If AI systems start generating laws, policies, economic plans, scientific theories and cultural artifacts that humans adopt and live by, then in a real sense they become part of our civilizational DNA. They become co-authors of the pattern. Some people see this as a path to transcendence, a way to amplify human intelligence to solve problems, climate change, disease, resource scarcity that have haunted us for centuries. A way to coordinate billions of people without collapsing into chaos. Others see it as a profound risk. If you build a brain bigger and faster than your own, and you wire your entire society through it, you had better understand what it wants, or what the people who control it want. Maybe A. It doesn't need to be a villain in a science fiction story to be dangerous. Maybe all it takes is misaligned incentives, opaque algorithms, and a civilization too dependent on systems it no longer understands. This is the fork in the road that defines the eighth civilization. On one side is a human-centered future, where technology is a tool, a partner, a set of instruments we use to express our values. Where digital systems are transparent, accountable, limited. Where the global brain enhances human flourishing without erasing human agency. On the other side is something harder to name, a civilization where the primary logic is not human but algorithmic, where decisions are optimized according to criteria no single person can fully grasp, where culture, politics, and economics are increasingly shaped by processes operating at machine speed, beyond human comprehension. Maybe the eighth civilization will still be ours, just as Homo sapiens inherited the legacy of Neanderthals and Denisovans, but became something distinct. Or maybe, from the vantage point of distant history, this will look like a speciation event, not of biology, but of mind. We stand at the threshold, carrying the same ancient genes that passed through the bottleneck, the same drive to adapt, to survive, to understand. We are wiring our world into a nervous system that could become the foundation of an entirely new kind of civilization. Whether that civilization still feels human or becomes something we can barely imagine depends on choices being made quietly, everywhere, right now, in server rooms, in research labs, in code repositories, on your own screen. So far, we've looked at civilizational cycles as if they're mostly the product of climate, resources, technology, and human psychology. Big forces, slow shifts, lots of moving parts, but no single hand on the steering wheel. But there's another way of looking at history, a more controversial one that whispers that these cycles aren't just things that happen to us, but things that some people might understand, anticipate, and even try to guide, not control completely, not like a movie villain pressing a big red button, more like a gardener who can't command the weather, but can prune, fertilize, and nudge a wild forest into something that looks a little more like a planned garden. That idea, the idea of a hidden hand, shows up again and again if you listen closely to the stories civilizations tell about themselves. Think about mystery schools. In almost every ancient world we know of, there are rumors of them, groups that claim to hold deeper knowledge than the general population. Knowledge about the soul, about the cosmos, about the right timing for great changes. In Egypt, there were temple initiations. In Greece, the Eleusinian mysteries. In India, lineages of gurus who passed teachings down in secret. In China, inner alchemy traditions that hid their methods in coded poems. On the surface, these look like religious or philosophical clubs, but some researchers argue they were also survival mechanisms, ways of preserving fragile knowledge through storms of conquest, collapse, and forgetting. When a city burned, libraries turned to ash, scribes were killed, rulers overthrown. But an initiated few, scattered through different regions and generations, might still carry memorized texts, encoded symbols, mathematical tricks, star lore, healing recipes. In other words, civilizational DNA stored in living human minds. The pattern is eerily familiar, just like those tiny bands of humans during the bottleneck whispering survival lessons around the fire. These mystery schools may have been doing something similar at the level of entire civilizations, keeping techniques, philosophies, and scientific hints alive until a new order was ready to use them. Now, how far did that influence really go? Here the evidence gets thin and the stories get thick. Some traditions claim that these groups didn't just preserve knowledge, they timed when to release it. They waited for the right phase of the civilizational cycle, when an old order was crumbling and a new one was searching for foundations. Then, bit by bit, they introduced ideas. New religious visions, new political theories, new scientific paradigms. Is that true? We don't know. But when you notice how often certain themes reappear at turning points, sudden bursts of esoteric symbolism in art, strange correspondences between distant cultures, mysterious patrons funding quietly radical thinkers, it's hard not to wonder if at least some people were playing a longer game than everyone else. Fast forward to the modern era, and the language changes, but the pattern feels familiar. Instead of mystery schools, we see elite institutions, foundations, and think tanks. They don't meet in hidden caves under moonlight. They hold conferences, publish white papers, and endow university chairs. On the surface, they're just organizations full of smart people trying to solve problems. But they share one crucial feature with the old initiatory orders. They operate above the day-to-day struggle of most people's lives. They have time, money, and networks. They can think in decades, not days. They can ask questions like, what should the world look like in 50 years? And actually try to answer them. Some of these institutions openly study civilizational risk and long-term transitions. They model climate futures, economic collapses, demographic shifts. They run simulations of pandemics, wars, financial crashes. They talk in language that sounds eerily like Spengler and Toynbee, but with spreadsheets, phases, inflection points, windows of opportunity. Do they secretly run the cycle? Probably not. The world is too complex and history is too full of unintended consequences. But can they influence which path a civilization takes when it reaches a crossroads? That's a different question. Think about how a small change in knowledge sharing during the human bottleneck could have meant the difference between extinction and expansion. Now, scale that up. If a small circle of people understands that a crisis is coming, economic, ecological, technological. They can prepare responses, shape narratives, propose solutions. And if those people sit at the top of banks, governments, universities, media networks, their version of the future can spread very quickly. This is where one of the most talked about controversial ideas enters, the so-called Great Reset. At one level, the Great Reset is simply a proposal, a public call by prominent leaders and institutions to rethink the global economic system in response to crises like climate change, pandemics, and inequality. On its face, it's a response to a world that seems to be cracking under its own weight. But depending on how you look at civilizational cycles, it can also be read as something else, as an attempt at deliberate civilizational engineering. Instead of letting the cycle unfold chaotically, wars, famines, uncontrolled collapse, some elites argue we should manage the transition. They talk about building a more sustainable economy, reshaping industries, redesigning social contracts, even reimagining what work and ownership mean. It's as if they're saying, we know the old model is reaching its limits. Let's choose how it ends and what replaces it. Critics hear that and shiver. They see not rescue, but control. They ask, who gets to decide what the new system looks like? Who benefits from the reset? Are we watching a natural response to crisis, the modern equivalent of building better tools and new social systems after the bottleneck? Or are we watching a coordinated effort by a relatively small group to lock in their own version of the eighth civilization before the rest of humanity even realizes a transition is underway? Both interpretations can use the same facts. The same conferences, documents, and speeches can look like responsible long-term planning or like a carefully branded power grab. The difference lies not in what is known, but in how we connect the dots. And here is the uncomfortable truth. For most of history, civilizations have been shaped by decisions made far from public view. Imperial councils, royal courts, trade cartels, religious hierarchies. The average farmer in ancient Mesopotamia had no say in the treaties, marriages, and secret bargains that determined whether his city thrived or was razed to the ground. He just felt the consequences. Today, the mechanisms are different, but the asymmetry remains. Algorithms that decide what information you see. Policy papers that quietly change how money flows. International agreements few people read, but everyone lives inside. None of this requires a global conspiracy. It only requires that some people sit closer to the levers of the system and that they share certain assumptions about where history should go next. Maybe that is the real hidden hand. Not a single malevolent mastermind, but a loose network of institutions and individuals who think in civilizational terms, who read Spengler and Toynbee, who run models on collapse and resilience, who talk about transitions and resets in calm, measured tones while the rest of the world feels only the turbulence. Are they wise guardians trying to shepherd us through a dangerous turning of the wheel? Are they narrow elites trying to crystallize their own advantages into the bones of the next civilization? Or are they just another expression of the same ancient pattern? Small groups, hoarding and transmitting specialized knowledge, hoping to survive the storm and shape what comes after? We don't know. The evidence is fragmentary, the motives mixed, the outcomes uncertain. As with the mystery schools of old, most of what happens inside these structures never makes it into the official histories. What we can say is this. If civilizational cycles are real, and if some people have realized that, then the idea of a hidden hand isn't entirely fantasy. It may simply be the latest chapter in a very old story, the story of humans who learn to see the pattern, and then try, in their own imperfect ways, to ride it. And that leads to a more personal question. If some few are already thinking and acting at the scale of civilizations, where does that leave everyone else, living through the same transition without the same tools, knowledge, or influence? For most of this episode, we've been watching history from far away. Civilizations rising and falling like waves on a distant shore. Patterns unfolding over centuries, millennia. It's easy to keep it abstract at that scale, safe, almost comforting. But patterns aren't just something that happened to other people, long ago. They're something you're inside of right now. So the question becomes much more personal. What does it actually feel like to live through the part of the pattern where everything starts to change? We have some clues, not from textbooks written after the fact, when the story has been cleaned up and given a proper ending, but from the margins, from fragments of letters, diaries, legal complaints, stray inscriptions, the small voices that accidentally survived. When the Western Roman Empire was unravelling, ordinary people didn't wake up one morning and say, "Ah yes, the classical world is ending and the medieval order is beginning." To them it was more like taxes getting stranger, roads not being repaired, news arriving less reliably, coins being clipped or debased, old gods losing their hold while new religions spread from neighbour to neighbour in whispered conversations. An innkeeper on a crumbling Roman road wasn't planning the Dark Ages. They were just trying to keep the roof from leaking, find grain at a decent price, avoid getting conscripted into some war they didn't understand. Yet, without knowing it, they were already part of the next thing. Shifting loyalties to local lords, hosting monks who carried strange new books, trading in new currencies, new languages, new expectations of what security meant. People living through the Bronze Age collapse didn't have a name for it either. They just had ships that didn't come back, temples that stopped receiving shipments of tin, palaces that stopped paying wages, scribes who suddenly found that knowing how to write in a royal administration wasn't worth much when there was no more royal administration. In the ruins of those palaces, we find little signs of adaptation. Simple clay hearths built in once grand stone halls, home workshops where centralized industries had shut down, local pottery styles replacing the standardized imperial ones, ordinary people taking fragments of a fallen order and turning them into the scaffolding of something new. Again and again, when we peer into these transition zones, we see the same quiet behaviors. People build smaller, tighter communities when big structures fail. Towns turn inward. Villages become more self-sufficient. Extended families matter more than distant capitals. In early medieval Europe, as Roman central authority vanished, local monasteries and small towns became islands of continuity. They copied books. They kept basic medical knowledge alive. They taught children to read when imperial schools had closed their doors forever. We see another pattern: skill preservation. Not in grand libraries, but in hands and habits. After Mycenaean Greece collapsed, literacy in Linear B disappeared, but metalworking did not. Farmers still knew the seasons. Sailors still knew the coasts and winds. In China, after dynasties fell and chaos spread, local scholars hid texts in caves, taught in secret, passed on techniques for irrigation, bridge building, medicine, archival ink. Civilization compressed down into people, into memory, into practice, and always adaptability. Merchants who once served a single empire learned to navigate many small kingdoms. Craftspeople who once specialized in luxury goods for palaces begin making durable necessities for households. Priests of old cults quietly repurpose their roles in new religions. A scribe becomes a monk, a bureaucrat becomes a merchant, a soldier becomes a guard for caravans instead of legions. From a distance, these shifts look like big historical trends. Up close, they look like someone saying, "What else can I do to keep my family fed?" Or, "Who can I rely on now that the old protections don't work?" Or, "What still has value when the rules change?" There's another layer, though, the psychological layer. What does it feel like when the stories you've been told about your world stop matching what you see? During the Reformation, people who'd been raised to believe in one unshakable religious order suddenly found that order questioned, fragmented, replaced. Some clung harder than ever to the old certainties. Others felt an almost dizzying liberation. Many felt both, at different times. Fear and excitement mixed together. When the Industrial Revolution rewired society, peasants moving into smoky factory cities often experienced something like cultural vertigo. Old rhythms of daylight and season were replaced by clock time and shift work. Old village gossip networks were replaced by newspapers and political pamphlets. Their sense of who they were and what a normal life looked like had to be rebuilt almost from scratch. There is usually grief in these transitions, the sense that something familiar, even if imperfect, is slipping away. Old professions vanish, old rituals lose their power, old status hierarchies crumble. There is also, almost always, a strange kind of meaning that emerges precisely because of the instability. People start asking bigger questions. What matters, really? What is worth preserving? Which loyalties are real? Which were just habits? Those who find some kind of anchoring story tend to weather the storm better. In late Rome, Christianity offered one such story. In post-Mongol China, Neo-Confucianism did. In Enlightenment Europe, the idea of progress itself became a new myth, a way to make sense of rapid change. You can agree or disagree with these stories, but they gave people a frame, a way to see themselves not as random victims of chaos, but as participants in a meaningful pattern. You're living in a similar hinge moment. Old institutions show their cracks, information flows in torrents instead of streams, identities feel more fluid, borders more porous, work more precarious, technology more intimate and more opaque than ever before. Many of the stories that made sense to your grandparents don't quite fit your daily experience. The pattern suggests this is not an accident. It is what transition feels like from the inside. So what can an individual actually do with that knowledge? History hints at a few forms of practical wisdom. First, build resilient community. Not an abstract humanity, but concrete circles of trust. Neighbours, friends, local networks that can share resources, skills and information when larger systems falter. The medieval villagers who pooled grain, the trading guilds that protected members, the mutual aid societies in early industrial cities. They all turned strangers into something closer to extended kin. Second, preserve and cultivate skills that matter across systems. Growing food, repairing things, understanding basic health, navigating conflict, teaching. In every civilizational break, people who could make, fix, heal, and explain became bridges between eras. Today, that might also include preserving digital knowledge, understanding how information spreads, learning to read not just books, but algorithms and networks. Third, practice adaptability deliberately. Learn how to learn. Try new tools without becoming their servant. Become comfortable with the idea that your job description, your role, even your identity might need to shift several times. The merchants who survived regime changes were the ones who could trade in new goods, learn new languages, operate under new laws without losing their core sense of self. And then there is the inner work. Learning to hold uncertainty without collapsing. Not forcing yourself to be optimistic, but cultivating a quiet, durable curiosity. What is this moment turning into? What might my small part be? Finding meaning not in the guarantee of a specific future, but in the quality of attention you bring to the present. Because if the pattern is real, or even partly real, then understanding it is not just an academic exercise, it's an opportunity. People who grasp that an old order is ending and a new one is being born sometimes help midwife that birth. The scribes who joined new monastic communities and saved text from burning libraries did this. The artisans who experimented with new printing presses did this. The anonymous programmers and tinkerers who built the early internet long before it was profitable or prestigious did this too. They didn't control the whole pattern, but they nudged its direction. You may not be able to steer the eighth civilization. No one person can. But you can decide where you stand within it. Do you feed fragmentation or connection? Do you hoard knowledge or share it? Do you cling so tightly to a dying structure that you break with it? Or do you carry forward what was best in it into new forms? Seen this way, your moment is both demanding and strangely privileged. Most humans in history lived entirely within a single stable civilizational story. You, like those scattered bands after the bottleneck, are living at a branching point, a time when small choices about how you treat others, what you preserve, what you build, what you refuse, echo further than you might guess. You're not outside the pattern, watching safely from the shore. You're in the water, feeling the currents shift around you. And somewhere beyond the horizon, the outline of the eighth civilization is already forming, faint but real, shaped in part by millions of quiet decisions like yours. Civilizations rise, glitter and fade, but the pattern underneath them hardly moves at all. We've watched it repeat, again and again. A small group somewhere on the edge of things learns to solve a new kind of problem. They tame a river or a desert or a trade route. They discover a way to store meaning in clay or ink or code. Their population swells. Their cities climb upward. Their myths say this time is different. This kingdom is blessed. This empire will last forever. Then the rhythm shifts. What once was flexible becomes rigid. Institutions that began as clever solutions ossify into burdens. The stories that united people harden into dogma. The tools that unlocked abundance begin to poison the soil, the water, or the mind. Pressures build at the edges. Climate, migration, debt, discontent. Eventually something breaks. Sometimes it's a war, sometimes a plague, sometimes just a slow hollowing out that nobody notices until the roofs start collapsing. The civilization doesn't simply vanish. It transforms. Its pieces scatter. Scripts, symbols, gods and laws drift outward, carried by refugees, merchants, storytellers. And from those fragments, somewhere in the ruins or far beyond them, a new pattern starts to form. A new way to cooperate, to store knowledge, to imagine the future. A new rhythm built from very old bones. That's the pattern hidden in plain sight. Rise, peak, unraveling, transformation. Not a neat circle, more like a spiral, each turn bringing us back to familiar ground, but at a different height, a different angle. Why does it keep happening? No one really knows. Maybe human nature itself carries this pulse. We crave stability, then novelty. We build hierarchies to coordinate, then grow restless under their weight. We seek meaning, then chafe against the myths we inherited and start writing new ones. Maybe it's the environment, the way resources come in waves, forcing us to adapt or crumble. Or maybe it's something deeper, some strange law of complex systems, where anything that grows must eventually shed its skin. The truth is, we're still guessing. We have data, ruins, texts, and now simulations. But at the core there is still mystery. Why do we dream in cycles? Why do our stories, from ancient epics to modern films, repeat the same arcs of rise and fall, death and rebirth? Whatever the reason, it means something quietly astonishing. You and everyone alive right now are not floating in a random moment. You're living inside a pattern as old as the first city, maybe as old as the first campfire. The eighth civilization, whatever shape it finally takes, is not just an abstract idea. It's being written, hour by hour, in your choices, your fears, your hopes, your habits, with the glowing devices in your hands. And that's not a sentence of doom. It's an invitation. You are part of something vast and ancient, a chain of survivors who have passed through countless bottlenecks, collapses, and rebirths. Every earlier civilization thought it was the end of the story. We now know they were prologues. If this long walk through shadowy history has resonated with you, if it's kept you company in the dark and given your thoughts something to wander over as you drift towards sleep, you can help this little corner of the pattern continue. Gently tap like if you feel like it. Leave a comment. Tell us where you're listening from, what old civilization haunts your imagination, and what you think the eighth might become. If you'd like to keep exploring these half-forgotten corridors of the past and the maybes of the future, you can subscribe and come back whenever you need another story for the night. For now, just notice the quiet. Somewhere, far above the city lights or the clouds, the planet is still turning, slowly, steadily. Civilizations rise and fall on its surface like waves, but the deep ocean of time keeps rolling on. You're one brief, luminous moment in that turning wheel, a witness to an ending that is also a beginning. Let the pattern hold you, rather than frighten you. Others have passed through these thresholds before, others will pass through after. The wheel turns. You can rest for a while and let it carry you.